Many people don't know this about Nintendo, but in 1889 was when the company was first founded in Japan. It started out as a playing card company, and eventually in the 1970s turned into a mass video game manufacturer. In 1889, Nintendo was basically just your average family business making playing cards in the form of Hanafuda, which was a popular type of playing cards in Japan at the time. From about 1889 to 1900, Hanafuda was rapidly growing in popularity, and to keep up with this, the CEO gave orders to mass produce all of the cards that they were making because of this growing popularity. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the very early history of Nintendo. I'm going to fast forward to like 1970, and we're going to talk about it from there because I want to get to the video game stuff. But basically what happened from 1889 to like 1969 was Nintendo making playing cards and trying to keep up with the market and going through various struggles with that. So Nintendo in the 1970s actually made an alliance with the American pioneer Magnavox to develop and produce optoelectronic guns for the Odyssey, which was a video game console released in 1972. And Nintendo partnered with this Magnavox company since it did things that was similar to Nintendo. In order for Nintendo to really enter the video game market, Nintendo had to partner with Magnavox, which they already did, and then figure out how to distribute its consoles, which was the Magnavox Odyssey, in Japan in order to release their very first game for the console. Now, moving forward to the early 1980s, Nintendo's video game department really started to create some amazing titles such as games like Donkey Kong. Now, from 1982 to 1988 was when Nintendo really started to pick things up, In Japan during 1983, Nintendo released something called the Family Computer Console as its first attempt at a cartridge-typed video game console. Within the first 2 months, at around $100, more than 500,000 units of this console were sold. And remember, that was in Japan, so Nintendo had to do something for the United States and other countries. So their plan was to release the Nintendo Entertainment System, which was a modified version of the Nintendo Famicom. And it was great, a massive success in the 1980s. But just as things were about to get great and were going great, the massive video game crash of 1983 hit. And Nintendo was devastated. At one point, I think that they were almost even bankrupt. It was so bad for the company. The crash began because people were getting bored of the mass numbers of titles that were being released every day, and people just didn't really want to play anymore. And also, a lot of the games were poor quality as well, so it caused all of the video game companies to go way down in value and all of their sales to cease rapidly. Another reason for the crash was that there were a lot of personal computers coming out at the time, which obviously was a lot better than the video game console situation, so instead of the video games gaining in popularity, they decreased, while the personal computer popularity increased. So I'm not sure if you all knew this, but the reason why the NES is called the Nintendo Entertainment System is so that Nintendo could avoid people associating video games with their console, although it was a video game console. They did this to avoid decreasing sales and also to avoid their console being affected by the video game crash. Honestly, a pretty smart move by Nintendo, if you ask me. The Nintendo NES was a massive success, reaching about 62 million sales by the end of its life. Moving along to 1989 to 1995 was when Nintendo started to do even better, with releasing the Nintendo Game Boy, which was their handheld, and the Super NES, a wonderful elaboration upon the predecessor, the NES. Nintendo also did release the Virtual Boy, which was a pretty big flop, but we like to forget about that. In the same way that they did for the Nintendo Entertainment System, they did for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan and the United States and other countries. In 1990, Nintendo unveiled the Super Famicom, which was only for Japan, and later unveiled the Super NES, which was for the United States. And boy, was that an amazing console. This time around, though, with the controllers, Nintendo decided to do something different and add more things. So, remember the NES controller? It was like a rectangle? Well, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System controller was kind of like a dog bone, and it added 2 extra buttons, X and Y, along with A and B. The console also still used cartridges and not discs. Yes, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System did sell a little bit more poorly than the Nintendo Entertainment System, but it still sold about 50 million units, which is still really great. In 1989, Nintendo came out with the company's first video game handheld, which was called the Nintendo Game Boy. It was basically just a giant rectangle that had a D-pad and an A and B button. And despite what you may think about it, it was still a really great console, and it had a lot of great games, such as Pokemon, Mario, and more. The Nintendo Game Boy was one of Nintendo's most successful consoles ever, selling over 118 million units. In 1992, Nintendo began making plans to create a console which they would later call the Virtual Boy, and would also be a pretty big flop because it was way ahead of its time. Basically, all the console was a really way ahead of its time early virtual reality machine that you had to put your face in and play games on. And to make things worse, it was red and black, and it also really hurt your eyes, which was why it sold so poorly. And sadly, the Virtual Boy sold about 770,000 units, and that was it. From 1996 to 2000 was when Nintendo released the Nintendo 64 and the Nintendo Game Boy Color, which were both really great consoles. And the Nintendo 64 was really innovative as well because it took advantage of the technology that was coming out at the time, which was 3D games. So, in 1996, Nintendo decided to do something even bigger than anything they had ever done before, which was release the Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64 was awesome because it had so much more power than both of the two home consoles before it combined. And it could play 3D games, which was a very new feature at the time. The Nintendo 64 also had an interesting kind of controller that had like 3 prongs, as if it was like some sort of fork, but it had a analog stick or a joystick, whatever you want to call it, which made it a lot easier to move around in these 3D games. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the Game Boy Color, but it was basically just a colorful Game Boy that had a better screen. The screen was a pretty nice screen, and it was way better than the original Game Boys because it was like white and not like green, so it was a lot better in that sense. The era from 2001 to 2003 was Nintendo's Game Boy Advance and GameCube era, which were both really wonderful and amazing consoles, and both had a great library of games and a lot of innovation. In March of 2001, Nintendo whipped out the Game Boy Advance, which was a lot more powerful than its predecessors. The Game Boy Advance also had a horizontal look to it instead of a vertical look, like the Game Boy and Game Boy Color had. The Game Boy Advance didn't do as good as the original Game Boy, but it still sold about 82 million units, which was really good. In 2001, during September, Nintendo decided to release the Nintendo GameCube, which was basically just a cube console with a very different but interesting controller. The Nintendo GameCube was really cool and good because it was the first console to use discs, and they were like mini discs, so Nintendo themselves and third-party developers could load a lot more game space onto the discs. The Nintendo GameCube also had a lot of backwards compatibility with other games, and the controller was one of the most revolutionary controllers in video game history as well. The hardware was really good, and compared to the Nintendo 64, the GameCube had a way better library and also had a lot better sounding games than the Nintendo 64. Moving on to the 2004 to 2011 era was when the Nintendo DS and Wii were released. The first Nintendo DS model was not exactly the best because it was pretty chunky, but then Nintendo decided to create a way thinner version and a lot more versions of the Nintendo DS, which were all less chunky and improved upon each other. But there were a lot of DS models which I'm not going to cover all of them. But basically the Nintendo DS was a revolutionary handheld that had two screens and was very lightweight, most of them, and could play a ton of games, including Game Boy Advance games if you wanted to do that. It was just wonderful. In total, the Nintendo DS consoles sold 154 million units, which was crazy at the time. On November 19th in 2006, Nintendo decided to release the Nintendo Wii, which was literally a crazy amazing console. It had motion controls, it was compact, it used bigger discs. It was just amazing. It came with games like Wii Sports and Mario Kart Wii, Super Smash Bros. Brawl. It had a ton of amazing games and used motion controls, which was very innovative at the time for Nintendo, and it was just a crazy amazing console. In total, the Nintendo Wii sold over 101 million units, which was absolutely record-breaking. 2012 to 2017 was about 10 years ago, and the Nintendo 3DS and Wii U came out during this time. The Wii U was one of Nintendo's flops, you could call it. It was not that great of a console, but the Nintendo 3DS was what kept Nintendo afloat during this time where they sold really bad with the Wii U. And the 3DS was a really good console. The top screen was bigger, and it was released in 2010, by the way. And the games were really fun as well. The Nintendo 3DS was also backwards compatible with all of the DS games, which made its library absolutely massive. I would call the Nintendo Wii U a flop because Nintendo just for whatever reason didn't know how to market the thing, and that was why it sold so poorly. The console itself was great. It wasn't anything like the Virtual Boy where the hardware was an issue, it was just the marketing. The Nintendo Wii U was a great console. I had one for a pretty long time, but then sold it to get my Nintendo Switch. Wish I would have kept it because it was a great console. Just Nintendo didn't know how to market it. And the Nintendo Wii U sold about 13.56 million units, which was not that great, but if Nintendo would have marketed it better, it would have been a lot better. So guys, thank you so much for watching through this video. However, this is where I'm going to have to end it because I've already done a video on the Nintendo Switch, so just go subscribe, go to my channel, and go watch that if you want to learn about the Nintendo Switch. But this is my video for all of the Nintendo consoles and Nintendo's complete history. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.